Namo Buddhaya. Welcome to today's Sutta class. So today we're going to learn a beautiful sutta taught by our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, which is found in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the book of the Nines. Okay, and the name of this sutta is called Velama Sutta. Okay, some of you may have heard this before, some of you may have not heard this before. But either way, this is a beautiful sutta that we all should read and remember from time to time, because it really gives us a good sense of the value. It gives us a good sense of how valuable this Buddha Sasana or the Supreme Buddha's dispensation is, and how much merit that we can collect when we come across a Buddha's dispensation. Okay, as you know, if we are experiencing some happiness in our life, the result or the secret behind that happiness is a merit that we have collected in the past. Okay, so if a person wants to be happy in this life, if a person wants to be happy in the next life, and if a person wants the ultimate happiness, which is called Nibbana, then something that person really needs in his life is merit. Because merit is the power that helps a person to go towards Nibbana. That's what Supreme Buddha teaches. Buddhahood is a result of past merit. Arahantship is a result of past merit. Okay? And Pacceka Buddhahood is a result of past merit. And if a person attained fruits and parts of the dispensation, it's a result of past merit. So as disciples of the Buddha who wants that ultimate happiness, merit is something that we all should collect into our lives. It's like that underneath fuel that helps us to go further in this Dhamma path. So this is a beautiful sutta that teaches us about how we can collect fruitful merit in this life that we have gotten. Okay. So this sutta was taught by our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha. And during this time, our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, was living in Savatthi in Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's park. So that is the monastery that was offered to the Supreme Buddha by the householder Anathapindika. Okay, and surprisingly, this sutta is also taught to the householder Anathapindika. Now, during this time, just to give you a background, during this time, Anathapindika, the householder, was in a very bad condition in terms of his finances. Okay, because Anathapindika, he was a very, very faithful devotee of the Supreme Buddha. In fact, he was the foremost donor. He was the foremost donor. He was the foremost lay household donor in the Supreme Buddha's dispensation, and he's the one who offered the Jetavana monastery to the Supreme Buddha. And the way he did it is so surprising that in order to buy the land, what he had to do was he laid gold coins in the entire land in order to buy the Jetavana monastery. If you go to India, even today, you can see the Jetavana monastery. It's a huge land. It's a huge piece of land. And in order to buy this land from the owner, who was Prince Jeta, what he did is he laid gold coins in the entire land. So imagine how generous Anathapindika was to do that for the Supreme Buddha, to make an offering to the Supreme Buddha. Okay, so he was a very rich person. He was actually a banker. And because he was so generous and because he gave so much to the poor and the Supreme Buddha and the Mahasangha, what he did for his living, he was a banker, so he would give out loans. And people who took loans, what they thought that since he's so generous, we don't have to repay him. So those people who took loans, they stopped returning back the loans. And so with time, what happened was the bank Anathapindika, he pretty much went bankrupt. Okay, so these are things that happens to even noble disciples. That's how the Supreme Buddha teaches. There are times that we get gains, there are times where we get losses. So this is the nature of life. Okay. So he was pretty much bankrupt and he was very poor. However, he never stopped giving alms. When he was rich, during his rich days, every day he would give alms to the Sangha during the morning time. So before 12 o'clock, any monk can come to his house and would be able to have a meal from his house. So thousands of monks would come to his house for meals. Okay. So now this was the condition when this sutta was being taught to Anathapindika. So during this time, our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, on an occasion where Anathapindika came to visit the Supreme Buddha, the Supreme Buddha asked, "Householder, are you still giving alms at your home?" Now the Supreme Buddha knows that Anathapindika is now in a very bad condition in terms of in terms of his finances. So that's why the Supreme Buddha is asking, Anathapindika, are you still giving alms at your home? And Anathapindika replies, "Venerable Sir, yes, I'm still giving alms in my home. But Bhante, I can't give delicious meals like I used to. The only thing that I can give to the Sangha is what I eat, and that is broken rice accompanied by rice gruel. So that was one of the most cheapest meals in India at the time. Okay, so it is some rice and some gruel. So he says, that's what I eat and that's what I give the Sangha. I have not stopped giving alms to the Sangha. So although he is so poor, he's still giving. Whatever he has, he gives to the Sangha. And the Sangha also, just as before, when he was offering delicious food, in the same way, the Sangha would go and accept this rice and rice gruel without any difference, out of compassion to Anathapindika. Okay. So at that moment, a great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, taught Anathapindika, the householder, if one gives alms, whether it's coarse or whether it's very delicious and excellent, if one gives disrespectfully, if one gives inconsiderately, if one does not give with his own hands, and if he gives what would be discarded, and if he gives without believing that what you give, but the way you give is the way you get back, if you give like that, then that is called an asapurisa dana. Okay, if a dana has these 5 characteristics, then that dana is considered to be a asapurisa dana. What are those 5? You give disrespectfully. That means when you're giving to the person, then you give. Sorry, the first one is actually asakkachang danande. Then that means you give without properly planning and properly arranging it. That's the first one. Okay, you don't prepare it properly. That's the first one. And you give without any respect towards the person whom you're giving it to. That's the second one. And you don't give it your own hands, you send it with somebody else. Okay. And the fourth is you give something that you want to throw away, something that's not of use to you. And you give without believing that when you give, you collect merit in return. Okay, and the way you give is the way you get back. So without believing in karma, you give. So if you give like that, this is remember the teachers, that is called a asapurisa dana. Okay. Now, for example, say you're giving um, a dress to someone. Okay, so when you give it, you don't arrange it properly. You don't put it in a nice bag. You don't put it or you don't wrap it properly. You just give it in a let's say a grocery bag. So you don't prepare it properly. That's called not preparing it properly. Or if you're giving a tea to someone, when you make the tea, you don't check whether there's enough sugar, whether there's enough milk, and you don't put it in a proper nice cup. You just give whatever, and you don't wash the cup properly. You just give it as it is for the sake of giving. So that is called not preparing properly. And you don't give it respectfully. When you give something to someone, you should give with respect towards that person. Okay. And you don't give it with your own hands. I mean, although you have the chance to give it with your own hands, you don't give it with your own hands. You tell somebody else to give it, or you say, oh, it's there, you can pick it up. So like that, you don't give it with your own hands. And the fourth is you give something that you want to throw away. So suppose there's a dress that you don't wear, so you give that to that person. Okay, so like that. And the fifth is you don't believe in karma. You don't believe that the way you give is the way you get back. So remember the teachers, if you give like this, then whatever the result of that gift is produced for one's mind does not incline towards the enjoyment of superb food, nor towards the enjoyment of superb clothing. Okay, so what that means is when you give a asappurisadana, as a result of giving, you get back wealth. Okay, so in your next life, you will be wealthy. But because you gave a asappurisadana, as a result of that, you don't feel like using the wealth that you have. For example, you have lots of money, but you don't feel like eating good food. You're eating like a poor person. You don't feel like going out to the grocery store and buying very delicious food. Your mind does not incline towards it. Why? What is the reason? Because in your previous lives, you have given asappurisadana. And you have lots of money, but you don't feel like buying a good vehicle. You have lots of money, but you don't feel like dressing properly. You don't feel like when you go shopping for clothes, you don't feel like buying nice clothes. You buy just anything. Okay, so just remember the teacher, as a result of giving asappurisadana, your mind does not incline towards enjoying sensual pleasures. That's one of the disadvantages that you have to experience when you give asappurisadana. And then the Supreme Buddha teaches another consequence of giving asappurisadana is in your next life, whoever is under you, it could be or whoever is with you in your family, it could be your children, it could be your wife or husband, it could be servants or workers that work under you. They don't listen to you. When you say something, they don't listen to you. They don't care about what you say, and they are not obedient. Okay, why? Because just remember the teachers, it's a result of giving asappurisa dana. And this is a problem that many people have. Kids don't listen to what they say. Husbands don't listen to what they say. Wives don't listen to what they say. Their workers don't listen to what they say. They do whatever they want, right? Why is that? Because in your previous life, you have given asappurisa dana. If a person has given asappurisa dana, it's one of the consequences of it. So imagine you have lots of wealth. As a result of giving, you get a lot of wealth. But although you have lots of wealth, one is you don't feel like enjoying those, you don't feel like enjoying the sensual pleasures using that wealth. And also your family is always fighting, is always in disagreements. No one is listening to each other. There's no harmony in the family. So can you live happily? No, right? This is remember the teaches, but however, householder, whether what you give is for so excellent. For so excellent means it could be something very small. Now, for example, at this time, another Pintika, he doesn't have a lot of money. So therefore, he is giving something, he is giving the Sangha something very coarse. It's not the most delicious food that he is giving. But that is not relevant. Okay, whether you give something very delicious and very, very tasty, or whether you give something coarse or rough, whatever it is that you're giving, if you give nicely planned and nicely arranged. Okay, so even if you're giving rice and gruel, if you give it, in a clean bowl, if you give it in a clean plate, yeah, that is called Sakkachandanandita. You have arranged it properly. Then you give very respectfully. Okay? And you give with your own hands. Okay? And you give something that you don't want to discard, something that's of value to you. But there are some people, if they have fruit trees in the house, in their house, in their garden, then they don't like to give the fruits when it's fresh. But once the fruit is all rotten, then they say, oh, you can have it. So what is that? That is the asappurisadana, giving what you want to get rid of. Let's suppose something that that if you're giving something that's of no use to you, that is asappurisadana. You should give something that's valuable and something that can be used. Okay. So this is remember the teachers, if you give something that is of value, and if you give knowing that giving has consequences, the way you give is the way you get back. Just remember the teachers, if you give like this, what you give could be coarse, but as a result of giving a sappurisadana, so Vimanda explains, in your next life, when you get wealth, you feel inclined towards using that wealth and enjoying sensual pleasures. So when you have wealth, you feel like eating delicious food, you feel like dressing nicely, you feel like making a good house for yourself, you feel like you feel like enjoying yourself. Okay. And not only that, as a result of giving a sappurisadana in your next life, your children, your husband or wife or workers under you, they listen to what you say, they're obedient to your words. So your family is very harmonious, there are no disagreements, there are no fights. You can live very happily. Okay, so this is a very good point. This is a very good Dhamma point which you can relate to your life, because if you have these problems in your life, then now you can at least now you can change. Okay? Realize that these results are a result of your wrong actions in your past, and so at least now you can correct yourself by giving Sappurisa Dana. Okay? And after the Supreme Buddha told this to Anathapindika, the householder, the Supreme Buddha continued to tell Anathapindika of one of the Supreme Buddha's past lives. Okay? And the Supreme Buddha is trying to make Anathapindika happy, although he doesn't have any money, although he's giving something so coarse. If you give like this, if you give in the proper way, you collect a lot of merit and you still can gain a lot of happiness. Okay, and then the Supreme Buddha continues to go on and tell about this past life of the Supreme Buddha to show Anathapindika how fortunate he is. Okay, the Supreme Buddha teaches Anathapindika, in the past, there used to be a Brahmin named Velama. Okay. He gave so much. He gave so much that he gave like a river flowing. What does that mean? When a river is always flowing, that is, he's giving, giving, giving. There's no end to it. He was that generous. And there's nobody in this world at the moment who gives like this. And the Supreme Buddha teaches, explains or describes his dana. He says, householder, that Brahmin Velama, this is the way he gave. He gave 84,000 golden bowls filled with silver. He would fill silver into 84,000 gold bowls and he would give. And he would fill 84,000 silver bowls with gold and he would give. That's the way he gave. And he would give 84,000 bronze bowls filled with bullion. And he would give 84,000 elephants decorated with golden ornaments, golden banners. And he would give 84,000 chariots, that means vehicles, that's decorated. Okay? And he would give 84,000 milk cows who are also decorated. And he would give 84,000 maidens adorned with full jewelry. And he would give 84,000 couches spread with rugs, blankets, and covers. And the amount of clothes he gave is uncountable. He gave so much. He gave so much that he gave so much food and drinks and refreshments. It seemed to be like a river flowing. He gave so much. Okay? And the Supreme Buddha teaches, you might think, householder, that Brahmin was somebody else. But you should know, but you should know that that Brahmin was myself in one of my previous lives. Okay, so it was our great teacher, the Supreme Buddha, as a Bodhisattva. He was born as this Brahmin Velam, and that's how much he gave. That's how much he practiced generosity in that life. He gave thousands of gold, thousands of golden bowls filled with silver, thousands of silver bowls filled with gold. Okay, so he gave that much. And he gave like a river flowing. So river flowing means you can't count. You can't count the amount of things that he gave in that dana. And the Supreme Buddha teaches, householder, however, at the time of the offering, there was no one worthy of offering. There was no one to purify the offering. So although he gave dana that much, the Supreme Buddha teaches at that time, during that time, there was nobody to purify the dana. That means there was no one to accept the dana who would make the results of the dana fruitful. Okay, there was not a single person who had the right view at that time. Why? Because the Bodhisattva was born during a time where there was no Buddha. If there was no Buddha, then there is no Dhamma. If there is no Dhamma, there's nobody who's following the teaching. So therefore, there's nobody with the right view. Okay? So remember the teachers, even more fruitful than the great alms offering that the Brahmin Velama gave, would it be to feed, would it be to give one person accomplished in view. So remember the teachers, if you give to one person who's a stream entrant, then the amount of merit you collect is much more fruitful than the merit that Velama Brahmin collected by giving that much. Do you understand? So the amount of things that the Brahmin Velama gave, you can't even count. He gave like a river flowing. But the Supreme Buddha teaches, if you give to just one stream entrant, then the amount of merit you collect is much greater than than the dana that Velama Brahmin gave. Then the Supreme Buddha teaches, even more fruitful than giving one stream entrant. Supreme Buddha teaches, even more fruitful than giving to 100 stream entrants is to give to one returner. That is called Sakadagami disciple. So if you give to one Sakadagami disciple, then that is more fruitful than giving to 100 stream entrants, Sotapan disciples. The Sakadagami means that is the second fruit of the dispensation, and that is once you become a Sakadagami disciple, you come back to the world of sensual pleasures once, and then you reach Nibbana. Okay, and then the Supreme Buddha teaches, if you give to one non-returner, that is an Anagami disciple, that is much more fruitful than giving to 100 once returners. So if you give to one Anagami disciple, that's more fruitful than giving to 100 Sakadagami disciples. So the more developed a person's mind is, the more fruitful the dana is. Okay? Then the Supreme Buddha teaches, more fruitful than that, more fruitful than giving to 100 non-returners is to give one arahant. If you give one arahant, the merit you collect is much more fruitful than giving to 100 non-returners, anagami disciples. Okay, so now you can only collect merit like this during a Supreme Buddha dispensation. If you're born in a time where the Buddha's dispensation is not there, can you find disciples who have attained the fruits and paths? You can't, right? So that's why when you give during eras where there is no Buddha, your dana is not purified, or it's not so much fruitful. But if you give during a Buddha's dispensation, even if you give to one person, that dana is much more fruitful than giving during a time period where there is no Buddha's dispensation. Okay. Then the Supreme Buddha teaches, if you give more than giving 100 arahants, is to give one Pacceka Buddha. So if you give if you give one dana to a Pacheka Buddha, private Buddha, then that is much more fruitful than giving 100 arahants. Okay, so during a Pacheka Buddha's times also, you can collect a lot of merit. That's why some arahant says they only gave one dana to a Pacheka Buddha in one of their previous lives, and that's the merit that helped them to become an arahant. So that's why if a person is fortunate to collect merit, practice giving during towards a Buddha, then those merit are much more powerful. Then the Sariputta teaches even more fruitful than giving to 100 Pacheka Buddha is to give to one Tathagata, Arahant, perfectly enlightened one. That is Samma Sambuddha. So if you give a dana to a Samma Sambuddha, that is much more fruitful than giving to 100 Pacheka Buddhas. Why? Because the Supreme Buddha's realization and power is much more than a Pacheka Buddha. And then the Supreme Buddha teaches even more fruitful is to give to the Supreme Buddha and the Mahasangha. Okay? You can collect much more merit than offering to the Buddha if you give to the Buddha and the Sangha. So that's why people who gave dana during the Buddha's time, they would offer dana to the Supreme Buddha along with 1,000 monks, 2,000 monks. Those are the kind of dana that they gave. So those dana are very much fruitful. Okay, so that's why even although the Buddha is not alive today, you can still think of the qualities of our great teacher, Supreme Buddha, and offer the first part of the meal to the Supreme Buddha in front of the Buddha statue. And afterwards, you can offer the latter part, thinking about Arahant Sariputta, thinking about Arahant Moggallana. You can offer the latter part of the meal to the Mahasangha. So at least then, if you do so with a pleasant mind, you can still collect a lot of merit even today. And then the Saramita teaches, more fruitful than giving a dana to the Buddha and the Mahasangha is to build a monastery for the Sangha. If you build a monastery for the Sangha who are coming from the 4 directions, then that is one of the greatest merits that you can collect with your wealth. Okay, so if you all have wealth, then these are merit that you can collect into your life, because you all are fortunate to be reborn. We all are fortunate to be reborn as human beings during a Buddha's dispensation, right? So that we can associate with the Sangha. We have the opportunities to collect merit. So these are merit that you can collect only during a Buddha dispensation. And this merit that we collect will come with us like a shadow that never leaves and bring us happiness. So if a person collects merit with the intention of reaching Nibbana, then that merit never leaves you. And it guides you to Nibbana for sure. That's why even if you offer a flower to the Supreme Buddha, even if you offer something small to the Sangha, you should do so with the intention, may this merit help me to attain Nibbana. That should be your only goal. Okay, all other goals should be apart from that. That should be your ultimate goal, really. Okay, so Supreme Buddha teaches, if you give a monastery, if you offer a monastery to the Mahasangha, then that is much more fruitful than giving a dana to the Buddha and the Mahasangha. So now imagine how happy Anathapindika must have felt when he's hearing this. Because he has collected all of this merit, right? He has offered dana to the Buddha along with the Sangha, and he has given dana to Arahants, Sakadagami disciples. And not only that, he has offered a monastery to the Supreme Buddha and the Mahasangha. So imagine how happy Anathapindika must have felt when he was listening to this. Right? Then the Supreme Buddha teaches, even more fruitful than offering a monastery to the Mahasangha is to take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha with a pleasant mind. So if a person wholeheartedly, with a pleasant mind, takes refuge in the Buddha is my only refuge. The Dhamma is my only refuge. The Sangha is my only refuge. If a person goes for refuge to the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, then that is much more fruitful than offering a monastery to the Mahasangha. So now, can everybody in this world offer a monastery to the Mahasangha? No, right? People are not that wealthy. But if a person is fortunate, that person can collect even more merit by wholeheartedly taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha. Okay, you have to do this with a pleasant mind about the Buddha. You take refuge in the Buddha with a pleasant mind about the Buddha, not just simply saying it. Now, in the beginning, when we started this program, we said Buddha Saranam Gacchami. But it's not simply just saying it. It's wholeheartedly going for refuge with a pleasant mind. Okay, so if a person can do that, then that is much more fruitful than offering monastery to the Mahasangha. Okay, so it doesn't take money, it doesn't take wealth to take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, but it requires a pleasant mind. That pleasant mind can only be acquired if you have truly understood who the Buddha is. That pleasant mind only can be acquired if you have truly understood the value of this Dhamma. That pleasant mind can only be acquired if you truly understand who the Sangha is, the Sangha qualities, or else you can't get it. Right? So that's why in order to get this pleasant mind, you need to learn Dhamma. When you learn, last time in our last session, we learned about the Velama Sutta, about how to gain a pleasant, about how to investigate who the Buddha is. Right? So through those teachings, you can really gain confidence and form a pleasant mind about a great teacher. So when you learn the Dhamma only, can you gain this pleasant mind? If you don't know who the Buddha is, if you don't know the Buddha's qualities, if you don't know the Dhamma, if you don't know about the teaching, then how can you form a pleasant mind? And if you don't have a pleasant mind, then how can you go for refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha? Right? So you do all of these things by using your wisdom. Then the Supreme Buddha teaches even more fruitful than taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha is to observe the 5 precepts established in the refuge of the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha. So that is taking refuge in the Triple Gem and also observing the 5 precepts. So if a person has taken refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha and also protects the 5 precepts with a pleasant mind, that's very important. The Supreme Buddha teaches if a person observes the 5 precepts with a pleasant mind, so he does so with a very happy mind, not because he has to, not because it's a law, not because someone is forcing him to, but he observes the 5 precepts understanding this is a real protection for me for this life and the next, and this observance of the 5 precepts will help me to attain Nibbana. So he does so with a pleasant mind. So now ask yourself, do I observe the 5 precepts with a pleasant mind? Having a right understanding, having a good realization of the purpose behind observing the 5 precepts. Okay. So these are merit that you can collect without spending a single dollar or penny or a rupee. right? But these are things that you have to do wholeheartedly. Okay. Then the Supreme Buddha teaches even more fruitful than taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha and observing the 5 precepts is to develop a mind of loving kindness for a small amount of time. He had said the time it takes to pull, the time it takes to milk, the time it takes to take milk from a cow. So that's like 15 to 20 minutes. Okay. So if you develop loving kindness for a very small amount of time, the Supreme Buddha teaches that if you develop loving kindness, even the time it takes to smell a flower. Now, suppose you take a rose and you smell the fragrance of that smell. So that is only a very short time, right? So remember the teachers, if you practice loving kindness even for such a short time, okay, this remember they explains that merit is much more fruitful, than taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha and observing the 5 ways. Now, this is not to say that you should not take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha and not observe precepts. Okay, because if you don't think in the right way, you might think like that. Okay, a person will only practice loving kindness if he has taken refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, and if he has observed the 5 precepts. Because without a sila, without restraining your bodily actions, you can't control your mind. You cannot go on to that step. Okay. So after a person has observed the 5 precepts and taken refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, then if he goes on in the path and practices loving kindness, then he can collect even more fruitful merit into his life. That's what you should understand from this. Okay. So loving kindness meditation, the Supreme Buddha teaches, is the greatest merit that you can collect in your life. It's like this, in the night sky, suppose there are many stars and then there's the moon. What shines more, the stars or the moon? The moon, right? So in that same way, the Supreme Buddha teaches, among all merits, the merit you collect by developing loving kindness is like the moon that outshines the light of all stars. You collect that much merit if you develop loving kindness. So imagine if a person can practice loving kindness every day, how much merit that person can collect into his life. Right? It doesn't take any money. It doesn't take a single penny from your wealth. Right? You can collect a lot of merit. That's why the Supreme Buddha teaches in one of the suttas, the Supreme Buddha teaches, "O bhikkhus, I practice loving kindness for 7 years straight." For 7 years straight, in one of my previous lives, the Supreme Buddha teaches, I practiced loving kindness for 7 years straight, and I collected so much merit that I was reborn in the heavenly world, in the human world, the heavenly world, the human world for many eons. So imagine how powerful loving kindness is. He says he was born as God's Sakka for 7 times. And when he is reborn in the human world, he is a king. He's reborn as a king for a very high class family. Is born to a very high class family. Like this, from heaven to human from human to heaven. He was in good world for eons because of practicing loving kindness for 7 years. So that shows how much merit you can collect by practicing, by developing loving kindness. So if you can at least do this for 5 minutes in your life, you can collect a lot of merit. So these are things that um, you should never, how do you call it? You should give importance to these things in your life and practice it. Because if you don't consider these things to be important and valuable, then you won't practice it. But if you understand the importance and significance of these good actions, and if you practice it in your life, then it can really bring you much happiness in your life. Okay. And then the Supreme Buddha teaches even more fruitful. So there's something that's even more fruitful than loving kindness. And that is, the Supreme Buddha teaches, even more fruitful than practicing loving kindness is to develop the perception of impermanence. Okay? To develop the perception of impermanence, the time it takes to snap. How long does it take to snap? Just a second, right? So if you practice contemplating on impermanence, if you develop the perception of impermanence, just for a single moment, the Supreme Buddha teaches, that is even more fruitful than developing loving kindness. Okay, so the Supreme Buddha teaches, if a person develops the perception of impermanence just for the time of a finger snap, then that is much more fruitful. Okay, so if a person can think of impermanence throughout the day, then imagine how fruitful it is, right? When you see people dying, you can think of impermanence, right? Everything is impermanent. You can practice impermanent perception like this. You can think of the impermanence of your six sense faculties, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue. It's always changing and it's becoming impermanent. And you can think that all volitional formations are impermanent. Everything that arises ceases, right? Everything that arises ceases. Everything is impermanent. Okay? And when you see a flower, you can see, in the morning, when you see a flower, it's beautiful. But when you see that same flower in the evening, what has happened? It has wilted. When you see that, you can see, wow, see, this is impermanence. Okay, so even for a single moment, if you can reflect on impermanence, then that is the greatest wholesome deed that you can practice in this world. Impermanence is such a powerful perception. Okay, it directly helps you to Nibbana. Even if you think of impermanence for a very small amount of time a day, that becomes such a strong it becomes such a strong practice in your mind, and it will come with you to your next life, and you will quickly be able to understand impermanence in your next life as well. Okay, so if you can take a moment and think, these eyes are changing, it's becoming impermanent, the ears, the nose, these six sense faculties are always changing, it's always growing, it's growing old, it's becoming impermanent. Okay, there will come a day that my eyes won't work, there will come a day my ears won't work, there will come a day my sense faculties won't work. That is thinking impermanence. There will come a day I will die. That is also thinking impermanence. So if you think about impermanence in your everyday life, then you're practicing one of the greatest wholesome things that you can practice in this rare human life that you have gotten. Okay? So in this way, in this sutta, the Supreme Buddha teaches, these are ways that you can collect merit into your life. But you can only collect these fruitful merit only during a Supreme Buddha's dispensation. Okay? So now you all are fortunate. We all are fortunate that we all are reborn as human beings during a Buddha's dispensation. Although the Buddha is not alive, we still hear the Supreme Buddha's teaching. Right? So we still have the opportunity to collect all of these merit. We can practice dana, right? We can make offerings to the Buddha. We can make offerings to the Sangha. We can practice loving kindness. We can practice perception of impermanence. So if a person uses this opportunity and does all of these things and collect merit into his life and develops these wholesome actions in his life, then that is the person who is slowly, gradually go and reach closer to Nibbana and ultimately end with Nibbana. Okay, so without collecting merit into your life and making your life filled with merit, you cannot go further in this Dhamma path. Merit is something you need in your life. Okay, so if you do these things with a pleasant mind, if you give dana, if you make offerings to the Buddha, the Sangha, and wholeheartedly take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, and wholeheartedly with a pleasant mind, observe the 5 precepts, develop loving kindness and impermanence, then you all can collect an immense amount of merit, infinite amount of merit. And if you do all of these things with the ultimate goal of reaching Nibbana, then you will be fortunate to completely eradicate all desire, hatred, and delusion and escape from this long journey of birth and death and experience the bliss of Nibbana. So may this beautiful sutta help all of us to collect the necessary merit into our lives, develop these wholesome actions in our life, collect merit into our life, and experience the bliss of Nibbana in this Gautam Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.